Mr. Speaker, and I will thank at this point the Whip's office from the Liberal Party for allowing me a speaking slot in tonight's emergency debate. I always appreciate a chance to speak. And I hope that the member from Malpeque can be called to order there. And this is a very important debate, and even at this late hour, I do want to discuss the emergency. C'est vrai que nous sommes...
It's true. We're facing an urgent situation. There is a climate emergency. It's an emergency worldwide.
Of this non-emergency that is the focus of tonight's debate, the private sector company sees the writing on the wall and decides to pull a project that it would probably never have built, even if it had pushed through to try to get a permit. The writing was on the wall. Now, I speak of the real emergency. This House, on June 17th of last year, passed a motion that said the following, quote, Canada is in a national climate emergency, which requires, as a response, that Canada commit to meeting its national emission target under the Paris Agreement and to make deeper reductions in line with the agreement's objective of holding global average temperature below 2 degrees Celsius and pursuing efforts to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, this is an emergency, and it's one that threatens not just our economy, but it certainly does threaten our economy. It doesn't just threaten Saanich Gulf Islands. Yes, it threatens Alberta. It doesn't just threaten Canada. It threatens the world. And if members in this place could please take the time to read the special report on what 1.5 degrees looks like versus 2 degrees. This was a special report prepared by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change at the request of all governments that negotiated the Paris Agreement in 2015. A request that was highly specific, that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change provide this specific information in time for the 2018 negotiations. Now, that emergency report should have sent shockwaves through every caucus in this place and right around the world. Certainly it did in many countries around the world, because what it told us very clearly was that holding to 1.5 degrees Celsius is not a political target. It's a target that is the only way we can ensure that our children will have a livable world. Not future hypothetical children, future generations, but the children we know, our children. For them to have a livable world requires of us that we hold to no more warming than 1.5 degrees Celsius. It's a hard concept, average global temperature. In a country like Canada that goes from minus 30 in the winter to plus 30 in the summer, 1.5 doesn't sound so very significant. But don't dismiss it. Understand that the difference in global average temperature on this planet between today and 10,000 years ago, when this, where we stand, was under thousands of kilometers of ice, the difference in global average temperature was 5 degrees Celsius. What the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change told us in October 2018 was that holding to 1.5 degrees Celsius was not an ambitious target that we might do if we could get around to it. It told us very clearly that if we want our own children to have a livable planet in a hospitable biosphere, we must hold to 1.5. They further told us it would be possible to do so, but it would require a global slashing of emissions by 45% all around the world by 2030. So now that the Liberals have given us this notion that we're going to get to net zero by 2050, it's clear that the current target, which was left behind by former Minister of Environment Leona Aglukkaq in the administration of Stephen Harper, that is the target we're talking about. The Liberals still have no plan to get to that target, and that target is approximately half of what we must do as a country. So yes, we're in an emergency, because if we miss slashing by 50% the global emissions, it's actually 45% against 2005 levels globally of carbon dioxide, is the IPCC advice. If we miss that, there are no do-overs. There are no second chances. We condemn future generations to an unlivable world in which human civilization may not make it to the end of the century. So it's very clear that globally people were paying attention to this Teck frontier decision because Canada has a role to play in the world, and it should be one of leadership. But we remain laggards. Earlier tonight in debate, some honorable members were mentioning what the United States is doing. At this point, the United States, yes, even under the Trump administration, is doing better at reducing greenhouse gases than Canada is. That's due to the actions of subnational governments, states like California, New York, and Texas. It's due to the action of cities. But Canada's record in this regard remains shameful. But we have a chance to redeem ourselves. I've never before seen anything like the letter from over 40 Nobel laureates sent to our Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister to beg them not to approve the Teck frontier mine. At over 40 Nobel laureates, most of them, by the way, are Nobel laureates in chemistry, although there's one who won it in economics, a few in medicine, and some in literature, including Alice Munro. But what they said in that letter, and I quote, was, "Projects that enable fossil fuel growth at this moment in time are an affront to our state of climate emergency. And the mere fact that they warrant debate in Canada should be seen as a disgrace. They are wholly incompatible with your government's," this is a letter directed to our Prime Minister, "to your government's recent commitment to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. The response to the climate crisis will define and destroy legacies in the coming years, and the qualifications for being on the right side of history are clear. An immediate end to fossil fuel financing and expansion, along with an ambitious and just transition away from oil and gas production towards zero carbon well before mid-century. As recipients of the Nobel Prize, we call on you and your cabinet to act with the moral clarity required by the state of this crisis and reject the proposed Teck frontier mine proposal." Ponder that. 40 Nobel laureates specifically begging this government to act as if we understand we're in a climate emergency. You know, Mr. Speaker, it's been said by Bill McKibben, who's one of the planet's leading climate activists and brilliant authors, that the first rule of holes is this: stop digging. Canada's in a very deep hole. We are far from our climate target, and that target itself needs to be doubled. What we can't do here is add new greenhouse gas production, and this project is enormous. This project would be well, if it had gone ahead, would have been twice the size of the city of Vancouver at over 24,000 hectares. It would have, as the environmental assessment report found, done irreparable damage to the environment, remove the forest, remove the muskeg, be damaging to wildlife, be damaging in many ways. Of course, there's never been, by the way, any environmental assessment process in this country that has ever said no to a project, just so you know. Clearing these very rigorous environmental reviews that we keep hearing about in this place can't be that hard because no one has ever been turned down. No pipeline has ever been turned down by any environmental assessment process in this country. No oil sands mine has ever been turned down by any environmental assessment process in this country, no matter which government drafted the law. So in this case, this is a project where even after all the environmental damage was cataloged, the panel found that the economic benefits of the project outweighed all the downsides. But as we have heard in this House, the economics were kind of wobbly because what Teck Frontier put forward as the precondition to this project being viable was that oil was selling at $95 a barrel. That's what they put in the report. That's what they relied upon. And as we've also commented in this place, there weren't a lot of investors lining up. Now, I think the Prime Minister of this country may have remarkable talents, and the reach of his powers may prove to be supernatural, but I haven't seen it yet. So I really don't think the Prime Minister can be held responsible, as the Conservatives in this House would like us to hold him responsible, for the price of the barrel of oil globally. It's beyond the reach of his powers. The reality is, investors are moving away from fossil fuels all around the world. Just listing the companies and investors that have vacated the oil sands is edifying. These companies have left because they're concerned about something that the former governor of the Bank of Canada has identified. Mark Carney refers to them as stranded assets, where you're left with, quote unquote, unburnable carbon. So if the fossil fuel business has something of a future ahead of it, it resembles something, visualize the games we played as children, musical chairs, and people start falling on the ground because the chairs are gone. Nobody wants to be left trying to find the chair that's in the oil sands, because that's one of the first places for investors to vacate, because it's unburnable carbon and very expensive stranded assets. Sweden's central bank left the oil sands and their investments in the oil sands, specifically stating the fact that that province, quote, is the highest in terms of carbon dioxide emissions. Shell, Royal Dutch Shell, has left the oil sands, stating specifically that they didn't want stranded assets. ConocoPhillips, Marathon, Total, even the Coke industries have vacated the oil sands and the investments there. Earlier, some of the speakers in this place referred to people concerned about climate change as fringe groups, eco-radicals, people without a really good grip on the finance sector. So let me just, perhaps members could imagine which eco-radical said this. On January 14th said, quote, "We cannot rule out catastrophic outcomes where human life as we know it is threatened," close quote. A suggestion that we're on the path to human extinction. That quote did not come from Greenpeace or the Green Party. It came in a leaked document prepared by economists working for J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan has been responsible and will be held forever on the wrong side of history for having spent $75 billion investing on fossil fuels in recent years. But now it recognizes that we cannot rule out catastrophic outcomes. In fact, they now announced that they will not invest anymore in new coal or drilling in the Arctic, but that's not really good enough. Goldman Sachs is the first big U.S. bank to rule out future financing of some forms of fossil fuels. They're not alone. BlackRock, one of the biggest investment companies in the world, BlackRock's CEO, has said that, quote, "Climate is almost invariably the top issue that clients around the world raise with BlackRock." Climate, the number one issue that their clients raise with them. So they're moving towards divestment. But this has to be, I think, perhaps my favorite quote on this subject, comes from Wall Street watcher Jim Cramer, who has a TV show that I've seen from time to time called Mad Money. It's an investment program on CNBC. And what he says is, quote, "Big pension funds are saying, listen, we're just not going to own them anymore. I'm done with fossil fuels. They are done," close quote. Obviously, Jim Cramer's been heavily influenced by our Prime Minister's brainwaves across the border to the United States. No, this whole notion that the Prime Minister is in any way at fault for Teck Frontier canceling is absurd. But here's the problem. Neither can he take any credit, because the government of Canada is still on the laggard side. We are still on the wrong side of history. We could do what's required. In the Liberal platform, we have a very promising commitment to a Climate Accountability Act. Where is it? When will we see it? This Parliament won't sit that long. It's a minority Parliament. Let's work on the things we can work on together. The majority of MPs in this House want a Climate Accountability Act with 5-year increments, not these targets that no one ever has to meet. By the way, 2020 is the year that Stephen Harper's climate promise falls due, this year, negotiated by the late and quite wonderful, the late Honourable Jim Prentice, approved by a cabinet that includes Alberta Premier Jason Kenney. 2020 is the year the Copenhagen target falls due, so by this year we should be emitting no more than roughly 600 megatons of greenhouse gases. The last figure we have is that we're at 716 or 717 megatons of greenhouse gases. But let's just imagine that we could magically get to Stephen Harper's target. Politicians in this country choose targets where they know that the due date will exceed their best before date, and somebody else will note that we've missed the target once again. That's why we need a Climate Accountability Act that measures in 5-year increments with an independent auditing function to know, are we meeting our targets? The surest thing we can say about this is that Teck Frontier was in financial trouble. Teck, as a company, had lots of issues. It has troubles with its mine in Chile. It has a lot of financial issues that were swirling around this. The business pages of this country were full of the stories, not of the Nobel laureates warning us that to approve Teck Frontier would be an act close to criminality when one considers the cost to our children and future generations and the peoples of the world if we continue as a country to boost our greenhouse gases rather than slash them. But the business pages were full of the speculation of the CEO of Teck, whose name has been raised in this House tonight more often than probably any CEO in Canadian history, but Don Lindsay was clear. We haven't done a feasibility study. We're not sure we can go ahead. But a month ago he said, still, give us the permit and we'll see if we can raise the capital if the price changes. This was a project that was never going to go ahead. But the Liberals have lost their chance for moral courage. They lost the chance to say we would never have approved this. This was, in the words of some Liberal MPs, an easy no. Stand for something. For God's sakes, while you have time in this place, Liberals, please stand for something. Stand for future generations, and please put in place a climate target well before we get to Glasgow in November so that Canada can once again be in the lead. Canada as a climate leader is still a possible sentence to imagine. But if I listen to the embarrassed, well, it really wasn't our fault, Teck Frontier didn't go ahead. Stand up. Say you would never have approved it, and then, Mr. Prime Minister, we can believe you might have a notion of being a climate leader.